Good morning, everyone. My name is Annette Johns, and I'm the Associate Director of Policy and Practice with the Newfoundland and Labrador College of Social Workers. I will be the moderator for today's education event, Self-Care and Social Work, Opportunities to Reflect and Reconnect. Today's topic is one that I'm sure will be of interest to you personally and professionally. The webinar will be approximately 60 minutes, followed by a 30-minute question and answer period that I'll moderate. And during the presentation, you can type in your questions at any time using the Q&A widget, and I'll begin asking our presenters the questions after the presentation. The recording of this webinar will be available in the coming days on the NLCSW website under the Continuing Education tab. And resources shared by our presenters today can be downloaded under the Resources widget on the left side of your screen. I now want to take a few moments to introduce our speakers, Kristen Hines and Megan Calder. Their full bios can be found in the bio widget, but I do want to say a few introductory words. Kristen is a registered social worker currently teaching at the School of Social Work and working as a social work clinician in private practice. She's also a member of the NLCSW Promotion of the Profession Committee. With a keen interest in the topics of burnout and self-care, Kristen has engaged in training and independent study to expand her understanding of these concepts and has been providing information sessions to individuals, groups, and workplaces. Megan is also a registered social worker currently working in policy and program development at the Department of Children, Seniors, and Social Development. Megan also has a great interest in social worker self-care and burnout and completed a thesis as part of her Master of Social Work program, exploring self-care patterns and burnout in a sample of social workers in Eastern Health within an organizational context. Both Kristen and Megan have also contributed articles on this topic in Connecting Voices. In our latest publication, Kristen, along with RSW Jasmine Barker, wrote an article titled Taking Our Power Back, Moving Beyond Pandemic Impacts. In July of 2019, Megan wrote an article about her research titled A Study on Self-Care and Burnout in an Organizational Context. So hop onto the NLCSW website after the webinar and under the Connecting Voices to access these great articles. And on that note, I'm so pleased that Kristen and Megan are delivering this webinar for us today, and I'll now pass the virtual podium over to them to begin the presentation. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Annette. Thanks for those wonderful introductions. I'm Kristen, and myself and Megan will introduce ourselves in a little bit more detail in just a couple of minutes. But before we jump into today's content, we really wanted to thank everybody for participating, whether you're here live or you're watching the recording later. We certainly can appreciate how busy the lives of registered social workers can be in the day-to-day. So thank you so much for joining us today. What we want to do to get us started is just to take, a very brief, maybe 30 seconds or so to just do a little mindfulness activity. And there's lots of talk about mindfulness lately, so it's nice for us to bring some of that practice into this webinar today. And what we want you to do, and I'll see, this is how I'm going to be tested now on my technological capabilities. There we go. The slide should have changed for you there. So I just want you to take 30 seconds. I'll start a little timer. You can grab a piece of paper and a pen if you have something there to write on and write with. And I just want you to think, what words come to mind for you when we say self-care? So just a quick little word association. No right or wrong answers, obviously. And just jot down maybe a couple of things that come to mind for you when we say the word self-care. Okay, so I won't take up too much of our time with that mindfulness activity, but it is a nice way when we're rushing from one activity to the next, when we're going from one meeting to the next, a quick little mindfulness activity like that one, like a quick word association, a quick check-in with ourselves, can be really helpful in terms of getting us grounded, getting us ready to transition from one thing to the next, and kind of helping us be really present with whatever it is that we're about to engage in. So thank you all for participating in that. And we'll move right along now to just introduce ourselves a little bit. So we know that the social work community in Newfoundland and Labrador is a very tight-knit community, and we may already know some of you who are participating in this webinar today. But just in case we don't, I'm Kristen. As Annette already explained, I'm a registered social worker. I'm teaching right now at the School of Social Work at Memorial, and then also doing some private practice. When it comes to the topic of self-care, which what we're all here to talk about today, I think it's really important that I kind of situate myself in my own experiences with self-care so that you know where I'm coming from as we embark on this next 60 minutes together. And my own experiences with self-care weren't exactly what I'd consider positive years ago when I first became a registered social worker. I think I had the belief that self-care was bubble baths and night outs and then like treats in the form of food and alcohol. And those things really didn't work for me. They didn't help me feel better. They didn't help me deal with stress. So I just got into the mindset that self-care wasn't for me, that I didn't need it, or that it was all like fluff, quote unquote fluff. And I tell my students now that when I was in their seat and someone started talking about self-care, I think I would pretty much zone out. When I started work, however, as an RSW, my ideas about self-care started slowly shifting. And I became more motivated to learn about self-care because of my own experiences with burnout and recognizing that if I didn't find ways to take care of myself, find ways that worked for me, then I really didn't believe I'd have longevity in my career as a social worker. So I became really personally and professionally motivated to expand my understanding of self-care and try some new things on so that I could figure out what worked for me. And then, I did that for the last close on 15 years now that I've been a practicing social worker. And it wasn't until I started teaching that I started to want to share the things that I had learned with other people. So being in a classroom, meeting social work students and seeing the future of our profession, I felt like I had a real wonderful opportunity to be able to start talking about self-care in those spaces. And then it's just kind of grown from there. I'm not here to position myself as an expert. I've learned a lot. Some of what we talk about here today may resonate with some of you and not with others. Some things that work for me may not work for you, and all of that has to be okay. Self-care is a completely individual and unique experience. And honestly, the only way I've been able to create some comfort in myself to be able to put myself on platforms like these is to start these sessions with just that very tone that I'll share my personal experiences, my research knowledge, the things that I've learned. And then it's up to you to decide if any of that sounds like it might resonate with you or if it might be a good fit for you. As a group of social workers, I have to say this is probably one of the most intimidating audiences to get in front of and talk about self-care, because I know that as social workers, we already have quite a bit of expertise when it comes to self-care. So my hope for this session today, I know we're a little bit limited in how much participation we can have, but I hope we create a space where you feel comfortable to be able to share at different points when we invite you to, and that we can all try to learn a little bit from each other. And that's kind of all I'll say about that. And I'll invite Megan to introduce herself.
Thank you so much, Kristen. Hi, everybody. I'm so happy to be here. My name is Megan Calder. So I've been a registered social worker since 2009, and I've been working primarily in child welfare ever since. I work in policy now, but I did spend the first half of my career working in frontline child protection in different program areas. So I've always been personally and professionally interested in taking care of myself in a very holistic way, and my interest definitely enhanced when I entered the helping profession of social work. My MSW thesis, like Annette mentioned, focused on this interest of self-care and burnout, and was published at MUN in 2017. And the title is Self-Care Patterns and Burnout in a Sample of Social Workers in Eastern Newfoundland with an Organizational Context. So generally, I'm not going to get too much into that, but I will say that in that research, generally, I found that more self-care equals lower burnout levels. There's all kinds of other patterns that I observed, and you can definitely check out my article that Annette referenced or check out my thesis itself to get into the specifics of what I looked at. I also became interested in burnout because of being in a demanding frontline protection job. I was always really curious about the times when I tended not to experience burnout versus the times when I was. And I think my approach to self-care definitely influenced how burnout showed up for me. Similar to Kristen, I associated with self-care as like luxurious type of activities, like long bubble baths or massages, like things that I thought I needed a lot of time for. And I might not have been in a mental space to even like think about what to do. But over time, my idea about self-care has really shifted. So I'm excited to share what I've learned and the relevant research on the topic that I have with you all today. So we're going to be giving an overview shortly, but we want to emphasize that we're focusing on self-care and burnout from an individual point of view in terms of what we can do individually. That being said, it's really important for us to both acknowledge that self-care and burnout is bigger than individual responsibility. It's imperative that the organizations we work with take responsibility when it comes to providing a culture where burnout can be managed where possible and self-care is encouraged. And we know that folks likely have a variable experience when it comes to this. So the reason we want to focus on the individual point of view today is that folks can have potential takeaways that you could actually start completing and taking charge of immediately, something that could inspire you to make some changes or just to think about something differently. Our intention is not to minimize organizational responsibility or anything like that, or how organizational dynamics and culture influence self-care and burnout. So talking about the organizational view would be an entirely other presentation. So maybe we can talk about that another time, but we just want to acknowledge that here today because that's very real, of course. And my intention today is to give language to concepts, different perspectives on familiar ideas that we all have. I think that when we have new language for something, or we can see it for what it is, we can see how it impacts us and what we can do to make change that we might not have thought about before. I think that looking at something in a newer, different way can make all the difference in how it affects us. So later in the presentation, I'm going to be discussing a book called Burnout, The Secret to Unlocking the Stress Cycle by Emily and Amelia Nagoski. The authors make a point at the beginning of the book that I want to share with you today because I think it's a good way to start. They acknowledge that usual self-care advice comprises suggestions like mindfulness, bubble baths, etc., which can be really good. They can be useful for things. I love baths. But as the authors note, quote, as soon as children are struggling in school, a partner needs support through difficulty, or a new work project lands in our laps, the self-care thing will get back on track as soon as I get through this. And that quote resonated with me because I generally have found in my life that it was easier to incorporate self-care activities or routines when things felt like they were going smoothly in life. However, life is generally not smooth and sometimes unpredictable, as the last few years have shown us with everything through COVID, for example. So I've learned that intentionally creating opportunities for self-care actually makes life go smoother or even just feel like it's smoother. So I thought that sharing that might resonate with some folks today as well. And I can honestly say, like, through all of my stages of life as an adult, I felt burnout or experienced difficulty with self-care in some way, whether that was working in frontline protection before I had children, after I had children, not working at all, and living in a different country when I had all kinds of free time. There's just so many elements to consider when we're trying to find out what works for us today, because it may not work for us tomorrow. So really excited to take you through. So I'll take you through an overview of the topics that we're going to cover today. First, I'm going to talk about what is burnout and why does it matter. Kristen's going to talk about how burnout can show up for us. I'm going to take you through a discussion of a key concept from the book Burnout, The Secret to Unlocking the Stress Cycle that I found particularly useful, and I hope you will too. Then we're going to both take you through self-care categories in terms of how the research structures self-care and just to talk a bit about examples and practical things that you can use. 7 different types of rest. I'm going to take you through that, which is a cool concept that I've recently discovered that may resonate as well. And then we're both going to take you through some tools and resources that can help kind of assess where you're at and give you some places to start. So what is burnout and why does it matter? So these definitions I have on this slide are from Herbert Freudenberger from 1975 when the terms were first coined. And these definitions were outlined in the burnout book I talked about earlier. So the first is emotional exhaustion, which is the fatigue that comes from caring too much for too long. Depersonalization is the second, which is the depletion of empathy, caring, and compassion. And the third is a decreased sense of accomplishment, which is that unconquerable sense of futility and a feeling that nothing you do makes any difference. So for my research, I looked a lot at Dr. Christina Maslach's work that talked about burnout in the context of helping professions. And she had developed a Maslach burnout inventory that helps folks assess where they are with burnout. And that's what I used in my thesis. So why does it matter? I think we all intuitively know that burnout is not good. I don't think anyone needs to be convinced of that. So we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on that. But I want to generally highlight what the research says about it. In her book, Burnout, Dr. Nagoski explained that how in the last 40 years, burnout has been coined. Emotional exhaustion is strongly linked to negative impacts on health, relationships, and work. Research has also found that when we experience burnout, the quality of care for clients is negatively impacted, and it's also correlated with self-reported measures of personal struggles like physical exhaustion, insomnia, increased use of substances, and relational difficulties. And something that Dr. Nagoski also discusses, and that I definitely saw in my research, is that traditionally burnout has been used in professional contexts in terms of that kind of space, especially with helping professions. However, the discourse around burnout is certainly expanding to different spheres of life. For example, parenting burnout is coming up as a topic in research, or even burnout related specifically to the pandemic. So I'll now pass things over to Kristen as she can talk about how burnout can show up for us.
Thanks, Megan. So Megan started with a great introduction for us in terms of what burnout is, like the definition of it, how it can start to show up. Because of the profession we're in, I think there's a recognition that there can be a higher risk of registered social workers experiencing burnout. And even though I know we're all social workers, and like Megan said, our understanding of burnout started as being in that professional context, it's important that we recognize that burnout may not only impact us at work, that when we're feeling depleted, it can impact us in all areas of our lives. On that same note, it's also really important that we recognize burnout isn't unique to just social workers. Those people who don't work in helping professions, people who don't work at all, can still experience burnout. The research will talk about certain characteristics or certain circumstances that can make people more vulnerable to burnout, and I want to recognize that. But I also want to say that there's no one particular life circumstance that will make you more or less likely to experience burnout. And we started this session by talking about our own experiences with burnout and self-care, and recognizing that it is a very individual and unique experience. Anybody with any number of responsibilities in any social location can experience burnout or excessive stress. And I know, like, I reflected on this a lot myself recently because I transitioned to an empty nest. So a little bit of self-disclosure here. And during that time in my life, I think people made a lot of assumptions about how well I must be, or how much time I must now have to do self-care, right? Quote unquote, do self-care. When in actual fact, that part of my life was probably the hardest experience I've ever had, and probably some of the highest levels of burnout that I've experienced so far in my adult life. So I just want to kind of reiterate that we can't assume if someone doesn't have children or has less children than we do, or works less hours, or has a different kind of life circumstance, that means that they must be less burnt out. Like, it's not meant to be this type of competition atmosphere around talking about burnout and self-care. We really want to create a space here where people feel like their own individual experiences are validated, and that any number of things can cause excessive stress for people, and any number of things can impact the ways that we cope with those things. There are stages to burnout, and we will spend a little bit of time on that today. I think it can be helpful to have a little bit of information. Can honestly be somewhat reassuring to understand that we don't generally wake up one day having just reached a point of burnout. So burnout is a very fluid process. And I'm going to show you this very basic graphic here on your screen. So this is meant to represent what Françoise Mathieu refers to as our zones. And I love being able to refer to Françoise's work in a session like this, because she has been one person who was very impactful for me when I started trying to do some self-assessments and self-reflection in terms of my own burnout and compassion fatigue and stress levels. So Françoise talks about how we basically have green, yellow, and red zones. So in the green zone, I bet you can probably guess what that represents. That's like our optimal functioning, right? So our burnout level, it may not necessarily be 0, but the green zone tends to be associated with wellness. So you can think about what your own green zone might look like, right? In terms of what kinds of thoughts tend to come up in your green zone, what kinds of things would people see you doing when you were in that green zone. Then we have the yellow zone, which is where we start to notice some of those red flags. So we're still going about our days, we're still getting things done, but we're more in that yellow zone in terms of our tolerance might be a little lower. We might have like less patience. It can look different for everybody. And you can spend a little bit of time either now or kind of after this session, just reflecting on what your own yellow zone might look like, what those red flags might be for you when you're starting to transition from that green to the yellow. And then the red zone is meant to represent when we're feeling completely depleted. So that's when we're really at our lowest level of functioning. And seeing as how I'm talking to a group of social workers, you could really look at these like green, yellow, and red in terms of a scaling question, right? So if I were to ask you to rate your level of wellness on a scale from 1 to 10, then you could kind of compare that to the green, the yellow, and the red. Another thing that this graphic depicts for us is you'll notice the arrow on the screen that's pointing back towards the green. And I intentionally chose that because I want to highlight that burnout doesn't mean that you need a new career, doesn't mean you need to completely change your life or that you've failed somehow. It can be great warning signs for us, can be great indications that maybe we need to look at doing things a little bit differently. It can take lots of messages from feeling like you're experiencing a high level of burnout, but it fluctuates, right? Burnout is very fluid, and you can do different things that will help you kind of manage when you're feeling like you're in that red zone in order to be able to work yourself back into that more comfortable yellow zone or even into the green zone. Francoise also talks about that everyone's zones look a little different. So this graphic doesn't do a great job at depicting that, but it's important for me to highlight as well. That your zones can be really wide or really narrow, right? So if someone has a really narrow yellow zone, then even when you're feeling really well, it may not take a lot for you to then feel like you're experiencing excessive stress or like you're experiencing some high levels of burnout. So having a little bit of recognition around how wide your zones may be can also be really helpful. And we really believe that knowledge is power, right? And there's being able to kind of reflect on your own self, reflecting on your zones, how they show up in your life. We'll share a TED Talk from Francoise as part of the resources that Annette referenced earlier. And in that particular video, she suggests ask people around you, ask your coworkers or your loved ones or your family members, what does it look like when I'm in these green and yellow zones? And she suggests that they will have lots of valuable information to share because sometimes we can notice these things in other people quicker and easier than we can notice them in ourselves. So when we think then about how burnout can look, right? Like we're talking a little bit about what it is, how it might feel. So it's important for us to give you a little bit of context around that. And we've just kind of organized it in this way to try to offer people, different things that might come up in your yellow zone or your red zone. So we've already highlighted that burnout is a completely individual experience. There are some common factors that people may experience, okay? So none of this is meant to be, hard and fast, or this has to apply to every person. And I want to reiterate that again. And also to kind of reiterate that burnout is not a fixed state, right? So we can often go back and forth between experiencing a little bit of burnout to experiencing a whole lot of burnout. So when we look at some of the things that burnout might feel like or how it might look, we can notice changes in our energy levels. We can start noticing emotional shifts and even physiological signs. So noticing that you're excessively tired. No matter how much sleep you get, you don't feel like rested or rejuvenated in any way when you wake up in the morning. And Megan is actually going to share some information shortly about the 7 different types of rest that was really helpful for me, even in trying to understand why no amount of sleep seemed to help me feel rested. You may start to notice like you have very little motivation. Sometimes we don't have any motivation at all. And this is one that you will tend to notice yourself before others notice it, because you're the one who knows what your quote unquote normal is in terms of your motivation, right? So it's about noticing when your motivation is impacted, like when it's not what it used to be or it's not what you're used to. We can feel really tired and unrested, can feel quite unmotivated, and that can impact us in so many ways. Like even things like basic physical care can suddenly feel like it takes just too much time and too much energy. So not showering regularly, not taking care of our physical health, hygiene practices sometimes start to suffer. I know I certainly noticed this myself in the heights of the pandemic, and I had to get really intentional with my routines in order to be able to deal with that. And that doesn't only show up in pandemic living, right? So it's important for us to be able to acknowledge that here as well. Our bodies tend to be really good at communicating to us when something is off. The issue is that we aren't always very good at listening. So you might get these physiological cues like headaches, muscle aches, stomach aches, issues with our digestion, things that can't be explained, right? So a muscle ache associated with a vigorous exercise, that's one thing. But muscle aches that you can't explain, sometimes that can be our body's way of telling us that we're carrying a lot of extra stress. We talked about physical energy, we've talked about tiredness, and then we can also notice changes in our energy in other ways. So we're lacking creativity, everything feels like a chore. We start to notice that we're using avoidance and distraction strategies more often than we normally would. Then there can also be cognitive shifts. So these, sometimes these can go hand in hand with the reduction in our motivation, but things that used to bring joy no longer do. Things that you used to be able to handle that maybe would be considered like, a little annoyance or something that you'd rather not do, but you're able to get through it anyway. All of a sudden, those things become like excessively stressful or seem completely unsurmountable. Sometimes we notice shifts in the way that we see the world. So you might feel cynicism, seeing the world negatively. And if I can be honest, again, that cynicism was the first red flag I ever noticed in myself when I started to practice social work and started to experience some symptoms of burnout. That was my very first kind of red flag. Sometimes it can be like everything starts to get on our nerves, like you're just in this general bad mood. Those cognitive shifts can then sometimes bring along changes in our behavior. One thing that the research has been showing more so recently is that can lead to like obsessively checking social media. That can sometimes be something that we do as a distraction or an avoidance strategy. Those disordered thinking patterns that we're probably all familiar with as social workers, noticing the all or nothing thinking, words like everything, always, never, they start to pop up in our vocabulary, in our self-talk, catastrophizing situations, making lots of assumptions, noticing the word should coming up a lot. And I remember a social work professor actually in my very first semester in the BSW kind of highlighting that word should. And when they were teaching it, it was about, in your work with clients, but it actually was really impactful for me when I thought about my own self and my own well-being. So noticing when those words start to pop up. Then there can be relational changes, increased suspicion of others, feeling really unsafe or unsettled, feelings of hopelessness or helplessness, noticing changes in our relationships with others. Maybe we have less patience or less motivation, feeling less connection, right? And again, from Francois's TED Talk, she talks about feeling like you're drained all of the time. So you might be experiencing a lot of stress at work, and that may not necessarily impact your work. You may still be, a rock star social worker, but where you do notice it is when you get home. Sometimes you feel like you have nothing left to give at the end of the day, and that can sometimes be a way that burnout creeps into our relationships. It's important for us to recognize, after having talked about burnout and what it is and how it can feel, and we're about to move into some concepts around self-care, but it's important for us to also recognize that sometimes self-care won't be enough. If you're sitting here now and you're ticking off all of these signs of burnout in your mind, it's probably hard to imagine that there's anything that myself or Megan could say that would help you feel like you've all of a sudden got it all under control. We all have stress in our lives. It can be in our personal lives, in our professional lives, and we're not naive enough to think that we can self-care ourselves completely out of it. What we do hope to offer here are some ideas that you may find helpful. While they may not be the complete answer that you're looking for, we are hopeful that we can provide you all with some new tools and resources that will ultimately help you engage in more wellness strategies and self-care. I was going to share a little example, but I'm really mindful of the time. So maybe we'll move along into some more information about self-care and kind of how it can look and how it can feel. And then if we have time at the end, maybe myself and Megan can share a few more personal examples. So I'll hand it over to Megan now to take us through some information from the Burnout book.
Thank you, Kristen. Thank you for that. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit to talk about the Burnout book. It came out in 2019 and I first read it this year. So in this book, it's called Burnout, The Secret to Unlocking the Stress Cycle by Emily Nagoski and Amelia Nagoski. And I've put a picture, Kristen, or one of us found a picture of the authors here to put here for the slide. The authors provide research, advice, worksheets in order to inspire positive change. I highly recommend this book so much. There's so many things to take from it. So I'm really just scratching the surface here today, really just by bringing one concept to light if you haven't read it. I first actually listened to it. I got very much into audiobooks when I was living in Texas and my commute was 2 hours in the run of a day and music just wasn't doing it for me anymore. So I started to listen to a lot of audiobooks. So now I'm really into it. And then I also picked up the hard copy too, because I found it so good to go back to. And I want to share some things that inspired me in new ways and gave me new language, which is my favorite thing. There's so much good information in this book, but I think this particular topic is really useful to the discussion that we're having today as it relates to burnout and self-care. And that's the discussion on the stress cycle. A lot of us certainly have some degree of knowledge when it comes to stress, for sure, in terms of how it can show up, our body's reactions to it, which Kristen covered in a lot of like different ways that it could show up for us in different spaces. For me, this section in the book really explained it in a relatable way and an easy to digest way with like appropriate use of humor perfectly, especially in the audiobook where the authors actually read it themselves. And it just made me want to tell everybody and just start using it immediately, which is such a great thing, especially when we are feeling burnt out. So the authors talk about, as I'm sure a lot of folks are familiar, how every system in our body has reactions to stress, like fight, flight, freeze, when stress is activated. And often we don't do anything sometimes to tell our body that the stressor has been resolved or addressed in some way. Of course, there are some stressors that can't be resolved, but there are still ways that we can process it when it occurs in our bodies. And something the authors do spend a lot of time on is really talking about that, the difference between stressors and stress, and just like piecing that out a little. And they talk about how there are many reasons we can't complete stress cycles, which means we're not telling our bodies that they're okay. And I found this really resonated with me too, and just thinking about it critically. The first is, of course, being in a situation of chronic stress, where we're just constantly stuck in a stress activating situation. And that in itself is not always bad. I mean, some jobs are rooted in crisis. A lot of us have been in those jobs or in those jobs where dealing with crisis is part of our jobs. And the authors really emphasize it's not that could cause problems and stress. It's bad when the stress outpaces our capacity to process it. The second that they talked about was social appropriateness. We may not be able to react how we feel in a given moment. So, if we're in an environment where we're in a meeting or something and something makes us feel stressed or upset, we may not be able to give that attention in the moment, and we might be going to the next thing and not give it attention. Third is safety. So there are definitely situations I can think of where something has caused stress for me, whether like out in public in different situations where I couldn't respond the way I might have wanted to in my head because of safety. And I'm sure a lot of folks can relate to that as well. So they give a lot of really good discussion around that with some cool examples as well. What the authors contend is that we're all walking around with incomplete stress cycles, and they present evidence-based strategies to complete such cycles. So I thought that was really interesting because what I started doing was I chose different activities and I did them a lot more intentionally and like, oh, I'm going for a walk today. I'm completing my stress cycle. And that's how I talk about it because there are some days, and I'll talk a little bit about the walks that I do, but there are some days that by 9 a.m., my stress cycle is already on blast. I have little kids, so sometimes getting out the door is very stressful. And then I might be coming right into work and just getting right to it. I might have a bunch of things to do immediately as well. I'm sure a lot of folks can relate to that. So I'm already in the midst of a stress cycle sometimes by 9 a.m. So at lunchtime, I will make an intention. Even if I can't take a full lunch, I might take 5 minutes and just like walk around my building with this intention to complete that. And it actually does wonders. But that may not work for everybody, but I just want to give that as an example because that's something that I do. Pop in my headphones, listen to great music, and just give her for 5 minutes even. So I'll just take you through some of the examples because I really like the way the authors describe these things, because all the things on the slide you see, none of these are brand new concepts, but the way that they contextualize them, I thought was really cool and helpful. So the first is physical activity, which they say research shows is the single most efficient strategy. So efficient, in terms of time and what you get for the input for completing the stress response cycle. And that's not just exercise. They go through a couple of case studies where they talk about their friend who hates exercise, refuses to do it, doesn't want to do it. So they introduce their friend to the concept of progressive muscle relaxation. And generally that just means kind of just tuning into your muscles and clenching and releasing, but there's ways and methods to do that if you wanted to look that up. And they do give examples in the book about that. And my motto with exercise is I only do things that make me feel genuinely joyful. That's the only exercise I will partake in. And I do enjoy some methods of exercise, but I think that's part of it also in terms of finding something that works for you and that makes you feel happy to do it. Breathing, so specifically deep, slow breaths. And they talk about how that's really most effective when the stress isn't that high or when it's very high, but you just need to siphon off the very worst of the stress so you can get through a difficult situation. Positive social interaction. I thought this was really interesting. And they describe this as casual but friendly social interaction because that is the first external sign to our bodies that the world is a safe place. And it's not necessarily with friends or family or people you know, it's anybody, like at a store or a coffee shop. And I thought about COVID in relation to this and thinking like how that was kind of taken away for a short time for a lot of us. Like I had a baby right at the start of COVID, so I wasn't going anywhere. So that casual everyday social interaction you get from just going to a store was just gone. And the world might not have felt like a safe place for a lot of folks at that time. I may still not, but definitely at the beginning when so much was unknown. And then I think about times when I've moved away and I've not known a single soul. So I think about the times I went to a grocery store or a yoga studio and I had a really positive interaction and like how that impacted me so positively. So seeing this in terms of the evidence-based strategy was really useful for me. It's just like a different idea, a way of looking at things. Laughter. So they describe this as deep, impolite, helpless laughter, which is one of my favorite things. And they talk about how neuroscientist Sophie Scott describes how when we laugh, quote, we use an ancient evolutionary system that mammals have evolved to make and maintain social bonds and regulate emotions. So this is something, it doesn't happen to me often, but when it does, I really give into it because it's such a wonderful thing. You can feel it in your body. That deep, impolite, helpless laughter that I love so much happens to me sometimes at work. Which is not the best time, but it does in terms of just interactions with coworkers and wonderful things. So it can be really, really helpful. Affection, and that's deep connection. So the authors talk about 20-second hugs and how the research shows that a 20-second hug can change your hormones, lower your blood pressure and heart rate, improve your mood, which is reflected in the social bonding hormone oxytocin that's been observed. And also, if you're not a hug person, you can pet a cat or a dog or spend time with horses that can produce the same type of feelings and hormones. A big cry. Obviously, there are so many stressors that we can't change, but something like that can complete the stress cycle. Creative expression. So the authors describe this as something that leads to energy, excitement, and enthusiasm. And I'm going to talk about a book, or just put it on the resource slide, Big Magic by Elizabeth Gilbert. That was an audiobook that was really fantastic in talking about creativity and how a lot of humans, especially as we become adults, like lose a lot of those outlets that we had as children or that we just had as a part of our life. And we can sometimes lose that as we get to be adults and like what it can do for our life when we incorporate it. And I don't just mean, traditional, obvious creative things like art or music. That is awesome, obviously, but it's not always just that. I mean, it's anything that's creative that uses your ideas to create energy, excitement, enthusiasm. And I think about myself with this presentation. I could talk about this stuff all day. So for me, this was a form of creative expression, being able to share what I know and my personal experiences and doing this with Kristen for everyone today. That gave me a lot of sense of creative expression in terms of feeling very satisfied with the work that I get to do. So that's just an example of that. I also want to acknowledge, and the authors do a really good job at doing this in the book, how we don't live in bubbles. And Kristen alluded to this earlier, that social location impacts the ways we experience burnout and the types of self-care we need, much like our employment, like where we work at an organization impacts that too. There are a lot of external forces in society that can put really intense pressure on us. And I think we need to acknowledge that. I'm just scratching the surface because all of these topics could be intensely covered on their own right. But I wanted to acknowledge them because they affect us every day, I think, to some degree. And the authors go into patriarchy. They talk about the bikini industrial complex, which is something they coined, which basically talks about, they define it as the $100 billion cluster of businesses that profit by setting an unachievable aspirational ideal for us, convincing us that we both can and should conform with the ideal, and then selling us ineffective but plausible strategies for achieving that ideal. So that's very wordy, a lot of words there, but they really go into it in terms of like how that can affect us in feeling burnt out and the things we feel we need to do. Some other issues like standards around like toxic masculinity and the expectations of men, racism, homophobia, transphobia. There's so many forces that could affect us. So we wanted to acknowledge that because everybody's personal experience with burnout and self-care is going to be affected by what affects folks in society as well. Like it's bigger than just an individual. So I'm going to pass it over to Kristen to take us through more discussions on self-care.
I almost forgot to unmute myself. So we're about 40 minutes in, if you can believe it. And we've talked at you a lot so far. If we were in a room together, this would be a great opportunity for us to invite some discussion. But of course, we're a little more limited with what we can do when we're all online. What I would invite you to do, if you're comfortable, is maybe open up that group chat box. And if you want to pop in there any of the words that came up for you in our mindful minute, or 30 seconds of mindfulness, when I asked what words come up when you think about self-care. If you want to share any of those in that group chat, now would be a great time to do that. If you're not comfortable sharing, that's also okay, obviously. And I've got the group chat open, so I'll watch it. If words start coming up, I'll read them out. I don't know if other people can see the group chat or not. So, we've talked a lot about what burnout might look like, how it might feel, how it can start to show up, how it can impact us. And Megan has started to kind of shift gears for us now in terms of also starting to talk about what we can do about it, right? What's some of the research out there in terms of self-care and what our bodies need when we're dealing with some of these excessively stressful things that happen in our lives. Self-care is really personal, right? And so now things are popping up on the screen, and they're such a diverse array of words that came up for people. Some people need silence. Some people wrote listening to music. Some people talk about exercising, needing interactions with other people. Someone talked about smudging. People who talk about nature and running. So some things that are really active, right? Some things that require more stillness, some things that happen independently, and other things that happen in exchange with other people. Family time, friends, faith and prayer, connecting with kids, intentional healthy eating, meditation, yoga. So many fantastic examples here of what self-care can look like or feel like to different people. Petting my cats. Yeah, I like that one. For me, it would be my dog, but animals can be so powerful for us in our lives. Joking. Excellent. Thank you so much for all that participation. We do also have a couple of polls. So want to just kind of get some information from the group. So you should see this here on your screen now. Just a quick yes or no answer question. Do you think self-care is important? So these results will be anonymous. I'll just invite you to choose one of the answers here now, and then I'll give it a couple of seconds before I share the results, because once I share the results, the poll closes. So do you think self-care is important? It's a loaded question, hey? Okay, I'm going to push the result here now. So So every single person who answered, 67 of you, I was trying really hard not to know how many people were online, but now I know. So everybody agrees. Yep, self-care is important. Okay, excellent. So the next question, do you know what works for you or what doesn't work? So we all agree self-care is important. Do we know what we need when it comes to self-care? I'll invite you to answer that one. This one's a little more tricky, I think. And I've got a room full of social workers who know that most things can't be answered with yes or no answers, and yet I'm asking you to do it. So I'll show you the results here. So a lot of people in the room, or in the virtual room, do have a good idea of what works and what doesn't work. And then we've got other people who feel like, no, honestly, I don't really know what works and what doesn't work. So that's great. Thank you for that honesty. Okay, and the last question. Do you think your idea about self-care has evolved over the years? So a little more reflection there in terms of your self-care practices have changed and grown and evolved, or do you have some tried and true strategies that have always worked for you and continue to work? A few answers coming in there. As the questions get harder, the participation gets a little lower. So I'll show you the results here. So for a lot of people, yes, their idea about self-care has evolved over the years. And for some folks, it's pretty much remained the same. So that's fantastic information for us to have as presenters as well. And then for you to be able to kind of reflect on what used to work and what doesn't work anymore. Maybe you've forgotten certain strategies that used to work, and this is a great opportunity to kind of remember some of that and see if they may be helpful to bring back into your self-care practices. So self-care is extremely personal, and I think we've said this, and it can definitely benefit from saying it again. What works for me may not work for you. Honestly, what works for me one day may not work for me the next day. So what we're going to do now is try to give you some real practical information about what self-care can look like, so that you have a variety of tools in your self-care toolbox. One thing that I do know that tends to be true for most people is that having a diverse range of self-care practices tends to be best. So if everything that we do for self-care is based on physical self-care, then it's probably a good idea to introduce some new strategies that come from one of the other themes of self-care. And then we've also learned that if you have one self-care strategy, that can be really risky, because if for some reason that becomes unavailable to you, then you don't have very many other tools to pull from. So this is why we're going to spend some time now going through these 8 different themes in terms of the different areas of self-care. So the first one there on your screen is physical. Everybody tends to know what physical self-care looks like and feels like. It can be about moving your body, but it doesn't necessarily have to be about exercise, right? So physical self-care is about so much more than exercise. It may be a vigorous workout routine. It may be going to a gym, or it may be choosing to take the stairs instead of the elevator. It may be getting up every couple of hours from your desk to make sure that you do a little stretch. Maybe you Google like chair yoga and just do some stretching of your upper body, some arm stretching. Any opportunity that you have to introduce some movement into your day and into your routine can be really helpful when it comes to managing both our physical and mental health. And we don't need to overcomplicate it, right? So Megan alluded to this earlier in terms of feeling like self-care is luxurious, right? People sometimes think that it has to take time, that it costs money, and it doesn't have to be that way. So just picking a parking space that's a little further away so that you get a few more steps into your day can be a form of self-care. Sleep can be a bit of a tricky one, and Megan will share that information later about rest. That's super insightful. But when we think about sleep, like, do you know how much sleep that you need in order to feel like you can get up in the morning and take on your day? What do you do to get ready for sleep at night, right? So do you have good sleep hygiene practices? Do you know what you need in terms of a bedtime routine? Like, for a long time, my bedtime routine was basically brushing my teeth and getting into bed. Whereas over the years, I've learned that I need a little bit more than that in order to unwind and kind of get myself ready to fall to sleep. So I'm a little bit more mindful of that now. I don't look at my phone immediately before I go to bed, those sorts of things. And then your morning routine can be just as important. So do you check your phone right away? This one comes from Mel Robbins, and she suggests sleeping with your phone in a different room, or at least on the other side of the room, because sometimes we connect with the rest of the world before we even take a minute to connect with ourselves. Are you someone who hits snooze a dozen times before you get up? Which is definitely something that I have done, and my husband is very upset with me when I do that. But I would hit snooze, and then I'd feel more tired throughout that day. So just being mindful of what your morning routine looks like as well. Next, we see on the slide there personal care, and I've kind of talked a little bit about that, and how for me personally I struggled with that during the pandemic. But just simply acknowledging that when I get up in the morning and I take a shower, this is how I'm choosing to start my day. This is about me taking control. This is about taking care of my body, and deciding that that is part of my self-care routine. Wearing clothes that makes you feel good. Doing little things like attending dental appointments regularly. Just little ways that you can start to take some of your power back. Especially, again, like Megan alluded to earlier, when we feel like there are so many things going on in our lives and in our workplaces that we can't control. These are little ways that we can reintroduce some control back into our days. Then nutrition and hydration. I'm not a dietitian, and I don't pretend to have all of that figured out, but eating things that make you feel good, and focusing on water intake. Like, if you're looking for one new thing to add to your self-care routine, maybe that's it, that you set a goal in terms of how much water you'd like to get in the run of a day. So again, physical self-care, like Megan said, can be the most efficient, but does tend to be more than just exercise, right? We'll move then into the emotional and cognitive self-care. So things like being able to effectively manage our stress. So we're not trying to eliminate our stress or avoid it altogether. Stress is a useful experience, helps us prioritize, can be really motivating, but we need to kind of work on managing it in a way that is helpful for us. So understanding our emotions, seeing our emotions for what they are, right? Information provided to us by our bodies to help us make sense of the world and the situations that we find ourselves in. So, appreciating the different emotions that come up for exactly what they are, and seeing the messages that are meant to be there. Breathing, and I think Megan already talked about this in reference to the book, but just really working on those belly breaths, right? So if I asked you to take a big deep breath now, a lot of times when I invite people to do that, it's the shoulders that go up to their ears, right? So we're getting lots of air into the top part of our lungs, but not in the rest of our lungs. It's really important that you put your hands down by your belly button, and when you take a big deep breath, your hands should come in and out with your breath. So working on that belly breathing. Things like expressing yourself, having forgiveness for yourself and for others, compassion and self-compassion, being okay, like I said, with any kind of emotion that you experience on that spectrum. And Megan already talked about fun and laughter. And I think I said this to her as we were preparing, like, I feel like I type LOL way more than I actually LOL these days. So look for opportunities to genuinely laugh out loud and to not stifle that, right? We all know that along with our emotions come thoughts. So being aware of our thoughts can be really helpful, how they impact our feelings and our behaviors. Asking yourself, is this thought serving me right now? Is there something that I need to learn from this thought pattern that I find myself in, or not, right? And knowing that what you focus on expands. And I'm not going to sit here and say that it's easy enough to control our thoughts, but just introducing that little bit of extra awareness. Indecisiveness, so working harder to make decisions, like make a decision and follow through. Sometimes that can be linked to insecurities. Sometimes it can be one of those red flags that you've moved from your green zone into the yellow or the red. So what I usually suggest for people, and what I do myself, is look for simple opportunities to make decisions. So notice all of the things that you decide in the run of a day, like whether you hit snooze or not, right? Whether you have coffee or tea in the morning. When you go to a restaurant, choose your meal before you seek input from the other people at the table around what it is that they're having. Just look for those little opportunities to make decisions. And then again, that self-compassion can come in there, to know that people generally do the best they can with what they have. You make a decision with the information you have available at the time. And I think Oprah said, or someone on her show, when you know better, you do better. So give yourself that little bit of grace when it comes to decision making as well. And Megan, did you want to jump in on the spiritual?
I sure do. So, for spiritual self-care, so for some that certainly means religion, and for some that means religion may not be part of it. Spirituality is obviously very personal, and it can be really incredibly impactful for many of us. Some of the most effective yet most underutilized forms of self-care is spiritual. The first really is talking about something of being connected to something bigger than yourself, or even feeling incredibly connected to yourself in terms of who you are. The Burnout book talks a lot about the concept of the importance of being connected to your something larger, and I really like that part of the book. So if you do pick up the book, that is a really wonderful topic that really ties it to the research and how it can protect against burnout, knowing what that is for you. Connection to community and culture can also be included here. For Indigenous folks, there's several events that occur through the year that create a lot of meaning for us in terms of creating community connection, like powwow, land-based activities, gatherings, and that can really help feel connected to something bigger than ourselves, to our community, and to our family. Participating in a group that promotes some form of spirituality, whether that be our church community, or other groups with like-minded folks that focus on mindfulness. There are great things around the city. I know not everyone, I'm sure, is coming from St. John's, but there's a lot of online opportunities as well through a lot of things that traditionally have been brick and mortar, say, in the city. There are places like the Lotus Center that offer a ton of different things, mind clearing, dyad work, yoga, meditation, and just workshops that like I have gravitated towards myself when I just feel like I want my people spiritually, just kind of want to be around like-minded folks that are just interested in learning more about that sort of thing. There's so much out there if you're interested in finding something. Mindfulness, so that could be mindfulness and meditation is separate because they're definitely separate, and they could have their own talks, honestly, in terms of mindfulness. So things like noticing your surroundings and just being really mindful, noticing things that might make you smile, like around your walk. Like when I go for a walk around the pond at work, I always notice the ducks and it makes me smile, or the eagles or something like that. Having a gratitude practice can be really helpful too. Meditation, which I did a meditation retreat one time where it just wasn't sitting meditation. There was also walking meditation, working meditation. So doing something that's repetitive and turning it into just like an inward meditative process. Yoga, and that could be restorative, that could be active, that could be chair yoga, could be anything. Journaling. So like for me, a personal note, I like to write sad songs when I'm sad in journal. That's like what I like to do for journaling. And that's really useful for me. But it's all about the intention in terms of what can work for you in terms of how you want to be mindful. Something I thought is really that I wanted to mention that's really practical that I really found useful when I felt really overwhelmed by the concept of journaling, because I've always journaled, but my life is very busy and it's really hard to just open up a sheet of paper and just start writing at this point, unless I'm writing a sad song. But there are things out there, Chapters has a ton of these called like Q&A books. So they're just questions. So I have them for myself. They're 5-year journal and they're just a daily question prompt. And some of them are really deep, and it'll really get you looking inward. Some of them are really like, what did you have for breakfast today? And then for the next 5 years, you can look back and see your answer. Sometimes I will literally abandon it for months and then I'll go back to it. And there are also those Q&A books for like your partner to do together. And there's a place for each of you to answer. And those are really great too. Some deep, some everyday questions that are really great for connection. In a busy day, you can answer a question and you make that time. There's also Q&A books by the same maker, and I can certainly give the links to this after, for children. So if you're looking for a way to connect with your child that's really quick, that just prompts like a really nice discussion that doesn't feel like really overwhelming at the end of a very overwhelming, stimulating day. These books are so great for that, and also gets them into the practice of looking inward as well. So I thought that that was really useful to mention here. Having a sacred or special place, listening to our bodies and making an effort to really be in tune with ourselves and listening. Nature, something that I've done since moving back to Newfoundland and Labrador is embracing dressing for the weather. I really try not to let the weather dictate how I feel about being in nature, because nature is so important to me, and I know it's so important to others, whether that be we have so much nature around us here. We're so lucky to have, the forest, the trees, the ocean, different bodies of water. So that is really important. There's so much great research to show what being in nature can do for us in terms of our nervous systems and our bodies. So next I'll move along to practical self-care. So everyone is different, of course, but they're all tasks we need to do and to accomplish, and tasks can pile up and can definitely contribute to burnout and being overwhelmed. One of my favorite phrases that I learned from some random YouTuber actually was, "How do you eat an elephant?" And it was like, you eat it one bite at a time. And that just quote helped me look at really challenging or cumbersome tasks in a new way, because I just didn't put the pressure on myself anymore to do everything all at once. For example, if your physical spaces are cluttered, that can make us feel very stressed. So developing a plan to keep on top of that. Like for me, my favorite thing to do is timers, because I just accept the fact that my house is going to be a bit chaotic. I have little kids. So besides my kitchen, not much else gets a lot of attention every day. So I set timers. So I'm like, okay, I need to deal with my room a little bit to make it a little more happy for like reading or whatever. So I'll set a 5-minute timer and just commit to doing that. And sometimes that's all I'll do, but it gives me that sense of satisfaction that I accomplished something. So there's all kinds of tips like that that can kind of help reduce that feeling of overwhelm. Valuing your needs, like identifying your needs and making plans to address them, like logistically. Like for example, when I became a parent, feeling overstimulated became my dominant stress. Obviously, when you have little kids, like they need you all the time, of course, even when they're growing. I mean, it never really changes that way. There's always someone asking me a question or telling me something, and that's great. I love being a parent, but I also recognize my need for stimulation breaks. So that might mean I'm going to plan to go to Shoppers tonight so I can have a quiet drive, or blast my music just so that I can just be with myself for like a 10-minute period before I go back into things. Or just intentionally resting without my phone, and putting on my eye mask in my room for 5 minutes, setting a timer, and then going back into the busyness if you can. Obviously, sometimes you won't be able to do that, but just recognizing what that means, and if you're an overstimulated person in that kind of environment. Budgeting. Money can obviously be a source of stress. There are so many great resources out there to help us focus on that. In terms of what we can control, there's so many great things that I found that have made me excited about budgeting, which I can't believe I'm even saying that, like on YouTube and books. And there's all sorts of things that can make you excited about that kind of thing that can really relieve stress or chronic burnout when it comes to that. Opening your windows, like the power of fresh air. I heard a quote one time, if your child is like having like a difficult time, like put them in the bath or take them outside. And I feel like that works a lot of the time, maybe not all the time. But I try to do that for myself. Like I just like need fresh air, and sometimes that can really make a huge difference. Intentional transportation. So whether you're the passenger or you're driving, tuning into what you need. Like, are you overstimulated? Do you need a quiet drive? Do you need to blast the music? Do you need to sing really loud to some emotional type of song to get your feelings out? There's so many things that you can do. And try to kind of perceive the situation in a way that focuses on what you can control. Like we can't control traffic, can't control construction. So if you're in a vehicle, like what can you do to control it and to kind of think about a situation differently? I had a lot of practice of that in Texas. Next is social self-care and social media. So I'm going to talk about the social side of things first. So that's just being aware. First is the concept of if you're an introvert or an extrovert, and just like exploring that. It's just kind of a cool thing to know, because I'm outgoing, but I'm an introvert. So when I understand about what I understand about introvert, introvert, you get your energy from, spending time alone with yourself. An extrovert, you get your energy from being around other people. But you can also be outgoing or not in those cases. So I really found that really interesting. I've done like different things online to kind of like, which am I or whatever. And obviously that might not always be accurate, but it's just kind of a good way to be in tune with yourself in terms of what you need. Communication to others, like especially if you're really feeling like you need to be connected to someone socially, if you're missing somebody, reaching out to them and saying, hey, I miss you, can we do this? Or just sending a text to a friend. You're both equally busy, hard to get in touch with each other in person, but just letting them know that you're thinking about them or you miss them or something like that. That can really do a lot for building connection to others, whatever that looks like. Creating boundaries. Of course, I think a lot of folks mentioned that in the chat, and that is a huge topic, obviously. Whether that be professional boundaries or personal boundaries in your own life, that could be a talk in its own right. Of course, in terms of what that can look like and how to set boundaries and like what that can look like in terms of what we actually say to people or to ourselves. And having support systems, asking for help when you need it, which can sometimes be hard, I think, for a lot of us who are helpers to do. Opting out of conversations that are overwhelming, stressful, or triggering for us. Like if we're in a group chat or if we're just part of a conversation that just really doesn't feel good, it's okay to just not contribute and just not be in that conversation. There's polite ways to do that. No being a complete sentence and not feeling like we need to over explain, and doing that work within ourselves to be comfortable doing that, which is definitely, I think, so much easier said than done. And there's so many great resources out there for that as well, in terms of being really happy with being able to do that. Kindness. Kindness is actually an action that has been shown to reduce stress in our bodies. So engaging in acts of kindness has been shown to help reduce blood pressure, boost your immune system, relax your nervous system, and shown to reduce symptoms of depression in some people. So that can be really helpful. Social media. So that's a huge one for me. I'm engaged in a lot of social media to some degree, but I'm very intentional on that because I did notice that takes a lot of my energy depending on what's going on. So like at work, I noticed my homepage was like msn.com or something like that. And I swear to God, every single day it would be very intense news articles that would be like the most tragic thing that happened in a community. And it was so overwhelming one day. It's like every single headline was so intense. And it was just from me opening up my homepage, trying to do work. And seeing that. And I really like to be aware of world events. It's really, really important, of course, for us to be aware of what's happening in the world. But it's also really important to really kind of be intentional around that in terms of what we're absorbing that we might not even be realizing. And I think about things like the news. I will check the news every day, but I don't have any of it in my social media. I don't follow any news articles or news outlets, I should say, aside from Twitter, because I don't want it to kind of enter into my my atmosphere without me seeking it out. So that's something that I do. Limiting screen time, limiting apps, just having awareness of it, not getting too caught up in the rabbit holes of social media comments. Kristen talked about how Mel Robbins in the 5-second rule talked about not starting or not sleeping with your phone next to your bed. So starting and ending your day with your phone, like being intentional around that, like that might be useful for some people. But I think the important point is just to be intentional and think about it. Mindless, endless scrolling. There's a quote here: the comparison is the thief of joy, and social media can definitely be the biggest instigator of comparison. So just being aware of that in terms of where being informed might shift to being overwhelmed. Like through COVID briefings at the beginning, I would watch every COVID briefing, and I just found that eventually very overwhelming, overstimulating. So for me, I just got my updates from Peter Cowan's Twitter, and that was a reporter that summarized the briefing. So I'm like, okay, that works for me. That's a 5-minute check-in. I know what's going on, but I'm not going to watch like an hour of this discussion because I just like, don't have it in me today to watch it. And obviously, sometimes comparison can be helpful. Someone might have dealt with something similar, but it's a slippery slope and a fine balance. So just putting it out there for us to just really be aware of that as we engage in social media. And I think I'll pass it over to Kristen now to touch on some personal professional self-care.
Yes, so we are nearing the end, but we did want to also talk a little bit about professional self-care and then some personal things that can also help when it comes to expanding our self-care practices. So the professional self-care is not necessarily the focus of today's session, but since we do have a group of social workers together, and we know that the research around burnout started around like professional burnout and burnout at work, it seemed a little negligent for us not to at least touch on this subject. We don't have a magic wand or any kind of quick fix when it comes to professional self-care, but we do have some small ideas that have worked for us over the years that we decided we'd be happy to share. So something that has worked for myself and Megan, something that the research support, is just trying to have some boundaries in our work. So do what we can to create a positive work environment. Like, we know that there are systemic things that add to our stress or that impact how we feel about our work. So one thing that can be helpful is to try to remain focused on the things that you can control rather than ruminating on the things that we can't, right? Do what you can to ensure that you take a lunch break, even if, like Megan said, there are days when it's 5 minutes instead of your 30 minutes or your 60 minutes. Do what you can to ensure that you give yourself that little opportunity to take a break, to complete your stress cycle. I drink tons of water, so I pee quite often. And when I'm in the office, I'll choose to go to a washroom that's a little further away. So I get that little extra break. Like, it might only be an extra minute, but it feels helpful for me in those moments. Every time I'm in the washroom, I take a moment to do a couple of belly breaths, right? So it's like being in that physical space of being in a washroom reminds me to do a little check-in. I'll take a couple of deep breaths. When I'm washing my hands, I'll pay attention to kind of how it feels, really lather up the soap. And that's been very helpful as we've been trying to live through a pandemic, but also just gives me a moment to connect instead of just running back to my desk. When I had a work cell phone, I had to get really intentional with my boundaries around that. And sometimes it's about making the technology work for you, right? So I didn't have the Outlook app on my phone. So if I wanted to check my work email, I had to open up the web browser and sign into it in that way. So instead of being inundated with emails and notifications all of the time, I intentionally chose when I was ready to check my email. So things like that can be really helpful when we're trying to create some boundaries. I use to-do lists all of the time. Sometimes I even manipulate the list a little. So if I start a to-do list at the beginning of the day, I might even write a couple of things on it that are nearly done or done already, just so I can feel that sense of accomplishment. Like, okay, I already did this today and I get to cross it off the list. And I certainly can't explain the science behind that, but there's something about it that helps you feel like you've accomplished something. We don't want to say that you're responsible for your work environment, because we know that our environments are much more complex than that. But what we are saying is that it can be helpful when we're trying to manage sometimes unmanageable workloads or expectations, can help us feel more grounded and in control when we focus on those things that we do have control over, right? What you eat for lunch, how you prioritize your day, whether you take one route to work or another. Being really intentional, like Megan talked about with that commute. And I worked on Kenmount Road when I started as a social worker. And if you're not familiar with Kenmount Road, it's a strip of road that feels like it's always under construction. And whenever you're on it, it feels like every other person in the city is on it as well. And that used to be a real source of stress for me, dealing with trying to get from work to pick up my kid at daycare, and just changing my thoughts around that, being more intentional, recognizing that I can be as angry and irritated and have all of the road rage, but it doesn't get me home any sooner. Puts me in a really bad mood for when I do get to finally pick up my kid at daycare. So I used to make more purposeful use of that time in my car. Sometimes I needed the radio on, other times I needed silence, windows up, windows down, warm car versus cool car. So just, being a little more intentional in terms of making use of the things that you already have available to you, rather than feeling like your self-care needs to be extra things that you add or things that take up extra time. Look for little opportunities throughout your day to incorporate some intentional moments of self-care. If you still have opportunities or expectations to work from home, that can also require some extra focus in terms of professional self-care and having some boundaries. For a lot of people, and myself included, having a space that was dedicated to work was really helpful. So there was some physical separation at the end of the workday. I did a session like this, more in the heights of the pandemic, and someone said the end of every workday when she was working from home, she would go check her mail. So she'd leave her house, get in her car, drive to the mailbox, and then as she drove back from the mailbox, it was like she felt like she had been at work all day. And it's just this little thing that she introduced into her routine. And she said, I know it sounds silly, but it was so incredibly helpful just to introduce that separation from work mode to what comes after work. Then we think about personal self-care. And you'll probably have noticed that a lot of the things that we've talked about so far today, they're very individual, very unique. Sometimes our intention behind things can be what makes the biggest difference of all. And it's all about balance, right? Having hobbies, things that are creative, like Megan talked about, like even if it is a new project that you get to work on at your work, or if it's things like those adult coloring books or drawing or puzzles, things that are new for you, things that give you a sense of novelty can be really helpful, can be a real mood boost. Megan already talked about pets, and I've graced you with a couple of pictures of my own pet there. If you don't have pets, then sometimes looking up pet videos, like YouTube videos of silly cats or dogs or farm animals. Creating goals, and you'll see there on the screen that we've referenced SMART goals, and I think we probably all know what that is. But just being really realistic with our goals so that we set ourselves up for success, right? Making space to do something that you enjoy. And I know we don't all have hours and hours in our day to play with. And when I started doing professional work with folks around self-care, it was with foster parents who really didn't have any extra time in their days for me to be suggesting things that took up time, right? So for some people, it was about going for a walk with the kids, or, just for that change of scenery to get out of the house. It was about listening to a podcast when they were running from one activity to the next, or picking up a kid or dropping them off. So looking for those little opportunities. Megan already talked about kindness, and that can be something that we do for personal self-care, helping someone else. And I know, as social workers, we're all helpers, and we are relational and social beings, and having those meaningful connections with people can really boost our moods in a way sometimes we can't even understand. Like, how good does it feel when you go through a drive-through and the stranger in front of you has paid for your coffee? And it's not that $2 or $3 is that impactful when it comes to your finances or your budget. But it just feels really nice to have that connection. And it feels just as good when you repay the favor for the person behind you. Having some self-compassion, and we've got a resource added as well that might help you with that if that's something that you're not familiar with or that you struggle with. But it's about working on changing our expectations for perfection. And this is a great exercise to think about in terms of the different roles that we play. And I think that came up in the chat as well. What expectations do we have for ourselves at work versus at home versus with our friends? We all play so many different roles in our lives that our self-care and our levels of stress and our ability to handle different things can look different in all of those different environments. Knowledge is power, which we've talked about. So we do have that. We have a self-compassion assessment that you can do if that's something that you feel like you'd like to learn a little bit more about, or maybe you'd like to try incorporating some more compassion for yourself into your days and your routines. Megan, did you want to jump in on the types of rest?
Yes, I do. Thank you so much. So this is pretty much our last general topic before we talk about resources. And this is something that I've discovered recently. So of course, we've spent most of the time talking about burnout and self-care. But I really wanted to talk about this concept because it gave language to those things in a different way. So I was first introduced to Dr. Sandra Dalton Smith through a TED Talk, and recently started her book on rest, Sacred Rest, which we have in the next slide. So her content has definitely been discussed in the media in a lot of different respects. So we thought we would share the way that Dr. Dalton Smith talks about rest. There's definitely a lot of similarities in the way that self-care is talked about and rest, but with a slightly different perspective. And something that stood out from the TED Talk that Kristen alluded to earlier was when she talked about how some people can get a full night's sleep and still feel utterly exhausted. So I related to that very much. Only recently, full night's sleep is not something I was getting for a while, but sometimes I do, and I still don't feel rested. So I was like, oh, that's very interesting. So the 7 different types of rest. So I'm going to talk through and give some examples. So the first type of rest is mental rest, which is likely required if you spend a lot of time in your day processing information, which I imagine would be almost everybody on this call, if not all. Those with a mental rest deficit may have a hard time like shutting off their brains at the end of the day. So ways that Dr. Dalton Smith talks about providing that rest is to do a brain dump at the end of the day into a journal, at the end of the day so your brain can let go. Doing to-do lists, like sometimes I'll do my to-do list for the next day at the end of a work day so that I can like let go of work. It also may work in the morning. I've done things on different retreats and through yoga where there was a concept of morning pages. So you could look that up because there's some really cool things about that. And basically that's also kind of like a brain dump. It's like a stream of consciousness you give yourself 5 minutes to do in the morning, just to kind of start your day however you like. So that's also a really cool thing. Spiritual rest. So that may include meditation or prayer. For others, that may include the feeling of a sense of belonging in a variety of contexts and community or with others that we've talked about. Emotional. I really like this one because it relates to identifying how we are authentically feeling and having the freedom to release that feeling. Some may call that vulnerability or authenticity. And obviously, we don't need to have this deep need with everybody, but I think it's really important that we have opportunities to be this way with a trusted friend or a counselor or a partner. Brene Brown, I'm sure a lot of folks have heard of Brene Brown that had done a lot of research on vulnerability. And Brene Brown definitely helped me feel comfortable with being vulnerable in the world. And I've really observed how being that way has really helped me feel very connected to myself emotionally. So I thought it was really interesting that Dr. Dalton Smith identified that as a form of rest in terms of being able to just be where you are authentically. Social. So just being aware of how different relationships pull on our energy and just resting around that in general. Sensory, downgrading sensory input. So there are certain environments that are very sensory, overstimulating. I think of Costco. I love buying things from Costco. Luckily, I have a family member that gets most of my things from Costco because it's such a good example of a place that's bright, lots of people, it's really loud. The parking lot's overwhelming to me. That's to me like a sensory overload, and I definitely do not enjoy going to a place like that. So if I have very little time, I try to do things either online rather than just walking into an environment like that because I require a lot of that rest because a lot of my days are really overstimulating. Creative. And Dr. Dalton Smith really words this beautifully, which means like allowing beauty to enter our lives either through nature or man-made like theater or museums. Just basically the feeling of awe and wonder that we really need to have that for ourselves. And physical, which she describes as actually two types. So passive physical rest, like sleeping and napping, which serves one purpose, but also active physical rest. So that means like restorative activities like yoga, stretching, massage therapy, leisure walks, things like that. So I definitely recommend you to check out that TED Talk. She has a TED Talk, and there's also a rest quiz that we're going to show in the resources. So, and that's just scratching the surface, but hopefully that is of interest to folks. So the next slide, we have just some resources that some of them that we've talked about, some of the book covers, Big Magic by Elizabeth Gilbert that talks about creativity, Sacred Rest by Dr. Dalton Smith, and Burnout, The Secret to Unlocking the Stress Cycle. So you can get them an audiobook or you can pick up the hard copy. TED Talks that Kristen mentioned earlier by Francois Mathieu. Dr. Dalton Smith also has a TED Talk as well. So if you just Google her and TED Talk, it'll come up. And there's two podcasts here that are really good. So the Nagoski sisters are talking about how to complete the stress cycle in this podcast. And then there's a podcast that's done by Glennon Doyle on her We Can Do Hard Things podcast, which is about burnout and do you feel half alive? And it's a really cool episode that just like really talks about that and gives a lot of words to it in terms of the personal experiences of the hosts. I listened to that one in particular. So like we alluded to earlier, I think it's really important that we not feel like we need to have like an all or nothing approach. We've just introduced or maybe reintroduced or spoke about things we've all kind of learned about in some way, shape, or form. And there's so many things that we could do. But I think it's really important that we kind of just start like where we're at. And Kristen's going to take us through some resources to really kind of that could maybe help you figure out where the best place is to start. And maybe you already know kind of where to start in your own particular journey. So I'll pass it over to Kristen.
Thanks, Megan. And this is really how we're going to wrap up. So a lot of times when we do sessions like this, people have questions around like, where do I even start? Like that's a lot of information, a lot of different themes in terms of self-care. Every different self-care expert presents it in a different way and with different language. So we wanted to provide you with a variety of information because we recognize that everybody needs something different. So hopefully we've said at least one thing that's kind of, resonated with all of you today. If you're feeling a little unsure in terms of what to do next, then some of those resources on the previous slide that Megan referenced, they're great if you want to like expand your knowledge or, you know, continue to learn and grow a little bit when it comes to self-care and wellness more generally. We've created this little self-care bingo, and I've used this with students in the social work classroom, and, you know, they're all adults, and I was a little hesitant, honestly, but it went over really well, where it's just like an opportunity to have really simple little things that you can try to incorporate into your regular routines that can increase our sense of wellness. So we thought maybe this would be a great thing for like a team to do together, or for you to do with your kids at home, or just to put it on your, you know, on your desk and take notice of when you do things for yourself. So that's one great place where people can start. The next is just this calendar of mindfulness. So Megan already explained that mindfulness and meditation are two totally different things, right? But sometimes they get used, people think that they're the same. Sorry, the words are not coming to me now. So this is just a calendar with 31 different things that you could try that would introduce some mindfulness into your day. Some of them are active, some of them are more still. Some of them are about like thinking, and then others are just, you know, introducing new things into your routines that you already have. So if you're interested in trying to introduce a little bit of extra mindfulness into your day, then this would be a great place to start. And then we also have all of these self-assessment tools. So we have 2 different self-care assessments that you will notice some similarities and some overlap, but then there are also some differences. I find this really helpful. I mean, I think about and talk about self-care every single day, but I still find these helpful to do myself regularly, because like I did a self-care assessment over the summer and realized there were certain areas of my self-care that I had been completely neglecting. So this self-care assessment kind of helped me check in that regard. There's a mood assessment that's available on the Bridge the Gap. So we've linked that one there as well. The self-compassion assessment, which I alluded to already, in terms of, you know, really kind of checking in with yourself in terms of our expectations for perfection or how hard we are on ourselves, and just kind of give us some ideas in terms of how we can introduce some more self-compassion. The REST quiz that Megan alluded to, the link for that is there. And then Wellness Together Canada is an online resource. So we recognize that for social workers, it can sometimes feel difficult to reach out for some professional help if we feel like we need it. So we wanted to give people opportunities to be able to access more self-directed ways of getting some little bit of extra support in terms of our wellness and our self-care plan. So the Wellness Together Canada is a great resource for that as well. Annette has put all of these links available for all of you, and I think she already explained exactly how you can access them. So hopefully this should be pretty user-friendly and easy for you to be able to click your way into any of these links that we've provided. And that is it for us for today. So Annette, do you have any questions that we need to answer?
Yes, well, wonderful. Thank you so much, Kristen and Megan. That was an excellent presentation. We do have a question that came in fairly early on in the presentation, but the question was around, do you think that the type of person you are, you know, psychologically makes a difference? So, for example, someone who goes through the same, you know, thing won't have burnout, whereas someone else might. Did you have anything you wanted to share on that issue?
Absolutely. Yeah. And you said that question came in early, and I wonder if we haven't answered it already, because that is absolutely right. The type of person you are, the type of personality you have, any previous experiences that you've had, all of those things will certainly matter when it comes to how you deal with different events in your life. In that TED Talk I referenced with Francoise, she talks about 2 people sitting in a car together in traffic, and how one person might be, you know, what a great opportunity for us to have a chat and listen to our favorite radio show, and they're feeling totally fine about it, while the other person is like white knuckled, road rage, you know, feeling really anxious and really irritable. And that was kind of her way of explaining that everybody will experience things quite differently, and there are so many individual factors that will influence that for all of us. Yeah. Megan, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, and I think that even obviously we're all kind of contending with our own psychology and our own experiences, but I think that time is in terms of like life stage or time of what we're going through impacts things too, in terms of how we might feel burnt out. Like today, I might not feel burnt out by a particular thing happening, but tomorrow I may. I mean, I think that discussion around zones is really helpful. Like my husband and I use buckets. Like and I learned this from like a placement in terms of like using it with children, but it's like my bucket is very full today. And the whole concept is everyone kind of has a bucket. And depending on how burnt out you feel, the bucket is more filled with water. And the more self-care activities you do to do things can take the water out of the bucket and just leave you with more capacity. It's just capacity, really. But that's kind of how we communicate it to one another. Like, my bucket is very full today. And it's like, okay, well, I can help siphon off some of that water. And just using language like that, I think, to communicate that in time and space too, because even no matter kind of what our experience is, our capacity, I think, changes depending on what we're going through, or different life stages that just might bring different things up, I think, for us.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We also had a comment come in, I guess, of another resource that someone wanted to share. It's the Working Mind, Workplace Mental Health and Wellness, and it's offered through the Mental Health Commission of Canada. So I just wanted to pass that along because that was a resource
Right.
that someone shared. And unfortunately, we're out of time. And such a great discussion. I'm sure we could go on and on with lots of more material, lots of more questions and answers. But in keeping with our time today, I just want to say a few wrap up words to really thank Kristen and Megan for this excellent presentation and for sharing your knowledge and expertise and experiences with us today as you explored self-care and burnout and social work practice. And I think regardless of where people are in their stage of life, in their career, this is important and timely discussion and important information. And we hope that this session provided people with information to integrate into their personal and professional lives. So again, thank you so much for joining us, Kristen and Megan. And it's always so wonderful when we can have our registered social workers facilitate these great sessions for social workers across the province. Do want to say that the PDF of the PowerPoint presentation is available in the handout section, and members and all the resources are there. And RSWs may claim 1.5 required CPE credits for attending this webinar as per the NLCSW CPE policy. And we also have an evaluation that we would ask that you complete that will appear on your screen. So your feedback is always greatly appreciated and helps us inform sessions going forward. So on that note, I just want to say thank you to Kristen and Megan again, and thank you to all of our social workers who joined us today. And we hope that everyone has a great rest of today, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.